Now this first method of attaching the rails is the one that we would recommend to most people, but especially the first time builders, as it's a little bit simpler to apply. Now the reason why it's simpler is that instead of worrying about getting the rails to wrap all the way around the nose or tail of our boards, we're just going to get it to wrap as far as we can, as you can see here. And then if it doesn't wrap all the way around our nose, well, it's not a big deal, because what we'll do is attach a solid block of wood here after the top deck is attached and create a solid nose block or tail block to hide those gaps and get rid of any issues. To attach the rails, we'll work one side at a time, working one section at a time. Begin by laying out one section of your rail over your frame, being sure to align it so that the edges are overhanging both the top and the bottom of your board. Now you're going to want a little bit of overhang at the end of your board here, because we do have to introduce that curve into the tail or the nose wherever you're working. Once you're happy with its alignment, you're going to mark the area on the frame itself that that rail strip is going to come to. Now unless you're working on a fish, you're going to want to steam the end of the rail sections so that we can soften the fibers and get it to bend more easily around the tail of our board. To do this, you're going to saturate the ends of the boards wherever it needs a curve introduced and wrap it tightly with the tin foil. The layers can be stacked together for this. There's no need to do it one layer at a time, but just make sure that the tin foil is wrapped around it nice and snug so the steam can't escape. Next, with the iron on a high heat, you're going to start going over the tin foil, flipping the boards over every now and then to get the boards nice and hot. It's really important that we get good steam penetration here, and that's what the tin foil is doing. It's locking that steam in. I typically will do this for anywhere between 4 to 10 minutes, depending on how tight a radius I'm going. Then, working quickly while the boards are still hot, you can start attaching the rail onto your side of your board using clamps, but no glue, and introducing the curve of your tail. The more clamps you can throw at it, the better, but do keep in mind that if you do overbend it, there is still a risk of snapping things here. So as long as it's nice and close to the end, you should be right. Now, just to be clear, your rails do not need to wrap all the way along. As you can see here, this example is going to have about an inch of tail with no rail wrapped around at all, and that's perfectly okay, because we're going to fix that issue with a solid tail block at a later stage. Once the curve's introduced, allow it to cool down for a few minutes, then remove the clamps and apply glue between the two layers of paulownia for the rails and the edge of the frames to where the rail comes to. Then you can clamp it back in place, just making sure that you're overhanging both the top and the bottom with both layers. Now when it comes to the clamps, I like to apply them to the lower edge of the rail, because that is the visible seam. So if I can get a nice tight seam down there, I'm happy. Now once that's clamped, you can allow it to dry. Now for the next section of the rails, we're going to need to cut an angle into the ends of them so that they match the angle of the first sections that we've already applied. This angle has to be cut in such a way so that the board itself will match the rocker of your board while meeting up with the previously applied rails and being a nice tight fit. Now to do this, I'll clamp the board into place so it's matching the rocker of the board with overhang on both the top and the bottom, and then I'll use a straight edge to mark a parallel line to the first board that we applied's edge to mark its angle. Now this typically gets me pretty close, but it's until I've cut that off and then done another test fit where I can see where I have to fine tune it. So if it's not closing up tight, I can come back and remove some from the top or the bottom and just tune that joint however it needs until it's fitting perfectly. Once the angles are cut, glue on that section as you did before, and continue this process until you're left with one continuous rail that is wrapping around one edge of your board. Now a quick note for those of you that are building a fish, we obviously don't have a tail to wrap our rails around at this stage, so what we're looking for is the rails to extend past the tail by just a small amount, as you can see here. Now to continue attaching your rails to the other side of your board, it's just a case of rinse and repeat, with the only exception being that you'll need to trim off any overhanging material that might interfere with the rails being attached. So you can see in the case of this fish, we trimmed off our first rail section and then actually wrapped the second section all the way across the first section, and that's a really good look. In the case of a rounded pin, you'll just trim that nice and close to wherever the glue seam ends. So once you've got your rails applied to both sides of this, you are done with attaching the rails, and you can move on to trimming the rails off to be flush with the bottom deck as well as the frame, but that is our next step.